My toxic parents kicked me out at 18, then showed up at my son's birthday begging for money. Later, they tried to take me to court for $40,000 I never stole. Hey everyone, so I, 28M, celebrated my son's 3rd birthday 3 days ago. It was mostly our co-workers with kids and a couple of my son's friends from his daycare with their parents. I'd also invited my estranged parents to the party after they contacted me 2 weeks ago asking if they could meet me to make amends with me. Some backstory here, so it makes sense why I don't get along with them. So, my parents kicked me out 10 years ago, a couple of months before I was supposed to start college. To make it extra special and poetic, they also made sure to kick me out on my 18th birthday. My parents were never the most loving or caring people. I'd say that I was pretty much ignored and unwanted throughout my childhood. And the only reason my parents didn't kick me out way before 18 was probably because it would be illegal, but they did so the first chance that they got, and I wasn't even surprised they were kicking me out. I was just surprised that they were doing it on my birthday and just a couple of months before college was about to begin. I tried to talk them into letting me live with them just until I graduated and covering my tuition, but they were very sure of what they wanted to do. They wanted me out of their lives so they could do whatever they'd wanted so far instead of wasting their time taking care of me. Their plans were to start their own business, which is a financial risk they couldn't take as long as they had me to look after, and then travel all the states in an RV. It was a great plan. I have nothing against what they wanted to do, but not at the cost of my future. I tried every manipulation tactic in the book to make them change their plans, but with no luck. I even resorted to crying and sobbing, but that didn't help either, and they told me that I had 1 month to vacate the house and find a way for myself to cover my own expenses. I'd already been working as a cashier at one of the stores in the local mall and saving some money to buy a car, but after my parents' talk, I decided to leave and put that money to use. I didn't have much, but I was extremely upset with my parents. I'd never liked them much, but after my birthday, I hated them. So within the next 2 days, I texted all my relatives if they'd be willing to help me out. Most of them turned their backs on me, which was unsurprising and a huge part of the reason I'd never spoken anything against my parents before. I'd never had anyone to count on. My friends were nice, but they had their own lives and wouldn't want me sticking around to live with them either. But I'm lucky that one of my distant relatives, one of my mother's cousins, Uncle Kevin, responded to my email and told me that I could come live with him, but I'd need to make myself useful for as long as I stayed. I just needed somewhere to go and live, so I packed my bags and left to travel to Utah to live with Uncle Kevin. I didn't tell my parents anything, and neither did they ask. I didn't even tell them goodbye one last time before I left, and I don't suppose they cared much about it. Uncle Kevin was a nice guy, and he did make me help him out with a lot of things around the house, but it was nothing impossible. He also ran his own diner, which was pretty popular among the locals, and he told me that I could work there as the cashier for the time being. If I was diligent and sincere, he'd pay for my tuition. He was a little eccentric, but he was rolling in money from his grandparents' inheritance, and since he had no family of his own, he could afford to spend his money on things like these. And that's how I paid for college, by showing my uncle just how serious I was at the diner by working well and honestly. After I graduated and moved out, I offered to start paying him back, but he told me not to bother and said that he'd collect his dues when I was a bigger success story. He was weird but sweet. Unfortunately, he never came to collect his dues since just a few years after I left, he passed away from a stroke. It was sudden, and by the time his housekeeper got him to the hospital, it was too late already. I'm thankful for whatever he did for me, and I'll always be grateful that he was able to at least be present at my wedding and take the place of my parents. Uncle Kevin never really got along with his family, including my mother as a child or even as an adult, so my parents were never able to find out where I spent those years and who covered my tuition for me, or maybe they found out, but they just didn't bother to contact me. Either way, I never heard from my parents even once after I left their house until a few weeks ago. They told me that they'd found me on social media through a cousin who helped them trace me down, since they'd heard from people that I was now married and even had a 3-year-old son of my own. They apologized in their message for all that they'd done all those years ago and told me that now they'd love to come see me and make things right with me, mostly because they wanted to meet my wife and son. I thought it was really half-hearted and almost didn't reply to them, but they sent another message within a day of that saying that they really wanted to meet their grandson while they were still around, and it was evident they were trying to emotionally manipulate me. Nevertheless, I agreed and told them to come over on the day of my son's birthday. I didn't have anything in mind particularly, but after talking to my wife and discussing the messages with her, she told me she didn't mind having them over as long as I was okay with it. She knows all the history with them, and we've been married for 5 years now. It's been 10 years since my parents kicked me out, so she told me that if I believed it was water under the bridge, then I could invite them. Her own parents had passed away when she was really little, and she'd been raised by her grandparents, both of whom had passed away in the last couple of years, so I could tell that she really wanted some family to be present at the party. I didn't care about reconciliation, but I felt like my wife actually did want them and wasn't saying it because she didn't want to strong-arm me into anything, so I did invite my parents for my wife's sake, and on the day of the party, they arrived an hour early before all the other guests so we could get some one-on-one time with each other. It was all very awkward and uncomfortable, but we tried to make small talk after I'd introduced them to my wife and son. They were polite and respectful for the most part. But then at one point, my wife went into the kitchen to make my dad some tea, and that's when my mother told me that she was here to discuss something else as well. She didn't want to say it in front of my wife, so they'd asked her to make tea. Now that it was just the three of us, my parents apologized to me again and said that they'd come to their senses now that they'd done whatever they wanted. They felt like they had really treated me badly during my childhood. I thought that it was pretty nice of them to apologize and that they'd finally started acting like human beings to me. But before I could accept their apology in person, they went on to tell me that they now needed money, and that was a major reason they were here. Apparently, they'd blown through a lot of their savings while traveling and now were falling short while trying to pay their bills on time. They wanted my help to live. They knew my wife and I were relatively well off. She's a real estate agent and I work in a bank, so we're comfortable and could afford to help them. I was very irritated by that because it just cheapened everything they'd said to me. I felt like it was all just a ploy to get me to help them out financially. They'd even used their grandson in their tactics to try and make me soften up towards them. While it hadn't been very effective on me, my wife had fallen for it. I didn't blame her, though. She didn't know just how awful my parents were and really missed her family, which is why she was so keen for us to fix our relationship. But I regretted ever having them over. I didn't say anything to them then because just afterward, my wife walked in with the tea for my dad and coffee for the rest of us, and she seemed very happy, so I stayed quiet. My mother told me to think about it, and my wife did ask me what we'd been talking about, but I told her that we'd talk about it later because I didn't want to get into an argument with my parents while the guests were starting to arrive. My wife talked to my parents some more for the next couple of minutes, and it was an easy-flowing conversation for her since she seemed to like them, but I sat there quietly because I just wanted them to leave before I lost it at them. Luckily, the first guests arrived just in the nick of time, and I jumped at the opportunity to distract myself. Once the guests were there, I busied myself with my son and the party arrangements, and then it was time for my son to cut the cake, which went well. Everyone had fun. Right after that, I was about to go into the kitchen with my wife, but my parents stopped me and asked me once more if I'd come to a decision yet. So I snapped and told them that they could wait in the living room with all the other guests, and I'd let them know shortly after everyone had received their slice. I took my spot in the middle of the living room and started off with a speech I'd been preparing in my head since my parents had stopped me outside the kitchen. I introduced my parents to all the other guests since no one had met them before, and they looked pleased that I was treating them well. But their smiles dropped from their faces as soon as I went on to the next part of my speech, where I started narrating the story about my childhood and how they'd kicked me out, after which I had to be taken in by my uncle. I wrapped it all up in lighthearted jokes, and everyone was laughing a little, but my parents looked humiliated, and my wife had a poker face throughout. I mentioned how my parents and I hadn't spoken for 10 years after they'd kicked me out, and finally, recently, they'd contacted me to meet their grandson. I'd almost ignored and blocked them. But then I changed my mind because I was just grateful that, unlike other nightmarish parents, at least mine weren't after my money. I was able to pass it off as a joke, and then I sat back down with the guests while my parents chuckled along uncomfortably. I'd managed to make the whole speech sound like a stand-up bit so it didn't ruin the birthday vibes. After some time, the guests started leaving, and my parents were the first ones to go. They left in a rush, and when I saw them to the door, they shot me the nastiest looks they could but didn't say anything, which I was thankful for because the last thing I wanted was to argue with them right outside the house. Once all the guests were gone and we'd put our son to bed, I finally had the chance to talk to my wife and explain everything to her. But before I could say anything, she lashed out at me and told me that my speech was unnecessary and stupid. I needed to apologize to all the guests and make sure they weren't uncomfortable, and also apologize to my parents for humiliating them for no reason. I stopped her there and told her what my parents had been here for, but she said that she didn't care and that I'd apparently ruined our son's birthday and made it all about me with that speech. I thought that was unfair because our son was just 3 years old, and it wasn't like he was even going to remember any of this in a few years or even in a few weeks. As for the guests, they just found it funny because of the way I told the story, keeping in mind that this was my son's birthday and not the appropriate occasion for any of what I'd done. But I just had to let my parents know how disappointing they were as human beings. My wife wasn't on board with any of it and told me that I needed to apologize to everyone present for my bad behavior. I was already very stressed out that day because of my parents, and the way my wife was freaking out over something that hadn't even bothered anyone else, but it didn't sit right with me. I felt like she was totally invalidating how I felt, even after she'd heard what my parents had come here for. I still felt misunderstood, so I snapped at her too. I told her that I'd invited my parents because she wanted me to, and if anything, she should be the one to be a little more understanding right now. But she was only thinking about how she felt, and I called her self-involved. That set her off and she started crying. I immediately felt bad about it, and I still do. I tried to comfort her, but she shook me off and told me I was the one being self-absorbed and hypocritical. She said that until I apologized to everyone who attended the party, she wouldn't speak to me. She even moved all her bedtime stuff to the guest bedroom and has been sleeping there ever since. We haven't spoken since that night because I haven't apologized to any of the guests yet. I don't think what I did was out of line, and I feel like my wife is overreacting to what happened at the party. I haven't heard back from my parents yet, and nobody from the party has said anything about my speech either. It feels like she's built this up in her head, thinking that people are going to judge us for that, but that's just not the case. I can't even communicate that to her because she refuses to speak to me. I also feel like she's not trying to understand where I'm coming from, because I ignored my parents for the sake of our relationship and to keep the peace before the party. I'd already dealt with them once, but I just couldn't take it a second time when they started putting too much pressure on me. The thing I said about my wife wanting my parents at the party more than I did was probably true. She didn't deny it when I brought it up during our argument on the night of the party. My wife's been acting like I completely ruined the party, but nobody cares as much as she does. I don't want to apologize to anyone because I don't think I did anything wrong. I tried to do everything the right way, but somehow, it didn't end well for me. My parents kicked me out at 18 and abandoned me for 10 years, so I think it was completely fair to humiliate them at the party after they tried to screw me over again by asking me for financial help. I tried to deal with things calmly, but I only acted emotionally after my parents pushed me too far. I really think my wife needs to understand that. I guess I can apologize for calling herself involved, but that's the most I feel I should do. Aside from that, I absolutely don't think I owe anyone an apology. I can't even consider apologizing to the guests, but certainly not to my parents for making a speech at my son's birthday to humiliate them after they kicked me out and cut me off for 10 years. Date 1. So, I talked to my wife about this today. The comments section on my original post was pretty divided on what I should have done. So I decided to just say screw it and talk to my wife because, after all, that's how our marriage will work. It's been 6 days since the party, and we've been not talking to each other, sleeping in different rooms. We've tried to keep it low-key for the sake of our son. But he's not old enough to notice these things yet, so there's even less of an excuse for us not to talk to each other. Today, before we left for work, I stopped her and told her we needed to talk. She didn't ignore me, luckily, and our son was having breakfast in the other room so we could talk peacefully. I told her I was sorry for calling her self-involved, but aside from that, I didn't think I should apologize. I didn't ruin the party for anyone like she believed, and nobody even cares about the speech. No one has brought it up with me, not even my parents. I told her, as gently and respectfully as I could, that I believed she'd overreacted a bit, and then I waited for her to respond. She agreed that she had indeed overreacted and said that for the past few days. Once her anger over what I'd done had cooled off a bit, she realized that she had acted very selfishly and hadn't been thinking about my feelings at all. She also conceded that she had sort of made me invite my parents to reconcile, even though she hadn't verbally said it. While we'd been discussing the idea, she had been very non-verbally trying to influence me because she was the one who really wanted a happy family for us, so I wasn't wrong about that after all, and she apologized for that as well. Her reasons were pretty valid if I think about it emotionally. All she really wanted was for us to have a complete family that she never really had as a kid. She had hoped that, as a married woman, she'd get some part of that, but her in-laws were estranged, so there was no chance for her son to get the same love and affection from his grandparents that she'd been lucky to have. She didn't get the love from her parents that she deserved when she was young because they passed away so early. And now her son would be loved by his parents, but he'd never have any grandparents, of course. That meant a lot to her because she'd been raised by her grandparents after her parents passed away, so it was a big deal to her. It was all these issues with her and her need to have a complete family that made her spaz out the other day, and she acknowledged it. I also apologized for not discussing these things with her and for the lack of communication that had actually led to all of this. So, to sum it up, we talked things through. Afterward, we came to the conclusion that we were going to have to deal with this in therapy. We already go to individual therapy, but now we're going to consider couples counseling as well for a few other unrelated reasons. Thanks for all the comments, you guys. I really didn't expect to be back here so soon, but here I am. Thanks to my parents, they actually sent me a lawsuit claiming I'd stolen $40,000 from them before I ran away 10 years ago. Now, apparently, they finally managed to track me down and they want that money back. Of course, none of it is true, and honestly, I feel bad for the lawyer they've hired. There's got to be someone desperate for cash because I can't imagine anyone in their right mind agreeing to represent them in something like this. Anyway, I'm not entertaining any of this nonsense. I've already contacted my lawyer. As for my wife, she's completely changed her stance on the whole situation. She's taken back everything she said about me needing to apologize to my parents. especially now that she sees what kind of people they really are. I'm sure they think they can still pull something over on me, just because I was relatively civil when they first came around, but that was only because it was my son's birthday. Now, there's no reason to hold back, so I'm putting everything out there online for everyone to see. Not just what they're trying to do now, but what they did to me in the past. Update 3. So, I posted everything. Every single detail I've shared here is now up on my Facebook profile. It's been 20 minutes and I haven't gotten any calls or texts yet, but I know it's coming. People are going to be furious, especially since I mentioned how none of my family took me in. But now that I'm in a better position, suddenly everyone wants to act friendly. Just to clarify, I've never invited anyone to any events, but now that they see I'm doing well, some of my relatives who shut me out in the past are trying to make nice with me, which is obviously fake. Now they have their own kids to think about, and I guess it doesn't hurt to have a well-connected relative who works in a bank and might be able to help them get jobs. So I know things are going to get heated now. I'm just waiting for it. Update 4. Hey everyone, I'm back after almost 3 days, so my parents completely lost it after I posted everything. They called me up frantically several times trying to get me to take it down. I didn't listen until they sent me a text promising that they would withdraw the lawsuit. Just needed it in writing, and I got that. After that, they blocked me. The real nastiness came from my relatives, though I mentioned them by name in the post, and they were absolutely triggered. They went off in the comments saying some really nasty things about me, my wife, and even my son. It was honestly just proof of what I've been saying all along. They're selfish, idiotic people. Ironically, their kids were the ones with enough decency to apologize for their parents' actions, which is just backward, but at least someone in the family had class. I've taken the post down now, but a lot of people have seen it, and that's all that matters. Everyone who turned their back on me in the past got their karma, and I'm glad for it. Long story short, my parents withdrew their case, everything's settled, my wife and I are still going strong, and that's that. Thanks for being here. Reddit, I think I'm going to take a break now. Signing off, bye.